Carl Jung once said that what you resist not only persists, but will grow in size. Most of us resist silence. We resist withdrawal. We fear being seen as cold, distant, selfish. But what if you've misunderstood the entire game? What if the world hasn't been reacting to your power, but feeding off your availability? What if your silence isn't weakness, but the beginning of something dangerous, disruptive, and deeply transformative? This is not a call to abandon others. It's a call to return to yourself. Because the moment you stop being available to everyone, you begin to discover who you really are. The world has conditioned you to believe that value lies in visibility, that to matter, you must be reachable, responsive, open, that to be loved, you must be known, and to be known, you must remain emotionally exposed. But that's not presence, that's performative accessibility. And while you were busy keeping the peace, answering every message, and showing up for people who rarely showed up for you, something else was happening underneath. You were becoming easy to map, easy to predict, easy to control. This is where Jung's shadow begins to emerge, because what feels like kindness is often just a fear of being unloved. What looks like loyalty is often just a pattern, repeating itself in silence. Carl Jung's idea of individuation was never about isolation for its own sake. It was about stepping away from the world's projections long enough to figure out who you are when no one is watching, who you are when you're no longer performing for love, praise, or safety. The truth is, the people around you don't respond to your essence. They respond to your patterns, your impulses, your availability. And when those patterns are predictable, they become programmable. You're not being seen, you're being used, not always consciously, but reliably. Your reactions, your anger, your apologies, your attempts to explain become levers. Others can pull when they want a response. You've become an emotional vending machine. All they need to do is press the right button. But what happens when the buttons stop working? What happens when you don't reply? When you don't defend? When you don't show up right on cue? The system collapses. The people who thought they knew you suddenly feel unsettled, not because you're being cruel, but because you're finally stepping out of the role they assigned you and into the truth of your own presence. This isn't about becoming cold. It's about becoming less consumable. And that's where the real shift begins. When you stop offering yourself reflexively, when you stop filling every silence and soothing every edge, you stop being an emotional service provider and start becoming a sovereign force. You stop being useful and you start being seen. But the journey to reclaiming your energy begins long before people notice you've changed. It begins the moment you ask, why am I still reacting to people who wouldn't notice if I disappeared? Because from that moment forward, individuation begins, not as a spiritual idea, but as a psychological rebellion. And rebellion, in this context, starts with understanding the programming that made you available in the first place. You weren't born available. You were trained to be. From the very beginning, your worth was measured by your usefulness, how quickly you could smile, how easily you could comply, how little trouble you caused when someone else needed peace. You learned early that love wasn't given freely. It had to be earned through behavior, through obedience, through silence. And somewhere along the way, you began to believe that your needs were negotiable, but everyone else's were sacred. This is not your fault, it's your blueprint. Carl Jung called it the persona, the mask we construct to survive in society. It isn't fake, it's functional. It's the smile you put on when you're breaking inside. It's the "I'm fine" you offer before even checking if you are. It's the habit of showing up for others while leaving yourself behind, again and again. But over time, the persona doesn't just protect you, it starts to bury you. You become so good at playing the role that you forget where the mask ends and where you begin. You say yes before you've had time to feel whether you mean it. You explain yourself when no one is listening. You anticipate what others need before you've ever asked yourself what you do. And because it's rewarded, applauded even, you double down. You become the one who can be counted on. the one who is always there, the one who bends without breaking until one day you break. But no one notices, because you trained them not to, because every time you abandoned yourself, you reinforced the idea that you could be stretched a little further. Because your kindness was never rooted in connection, it was rooted in fear. Fear of being unloved, fear of being rejected, fear of being alone. So you became a mirror for other people's needs, and in doing so, lost sight of your own reflection. This is the cost of the mask. This is the silent toll of always being good. And until you recognize that this performance isn't who you are, it's who you became to survive, you'll keep mistaking approval for intimacy and overextension for worth. But something in you is waking up now. You're starting to feel the weight of what you've been carrying. You're beginning to sense that perhaps the real danger isn't being misunderstood, but never being known at all. And if that feeling has started to surface, you're closer than you think to stepping off the stage and walking into the truth of your own life. Because once you see the mask, you can't unsee it. And once you start asking who benefits from your exhaustion, you're already beginning to take your power back. When you live through a mask long enough, something strange begins to happen. You stop being seen for who you are and start being used for what you give. At first, it's subtle. People call you dependable, empathetic, easy to talk to. But underneath those compliments is a quiet contract. You stay available, and I stay comfortable. You become the go-to listener, the emotional anchor, the fixer. Not because they value you, but because they value how they feel around you. Your emotional labor becomes a service. Your identity becomes a role. And the role is addictive, because it looks like connection. But it's not. True connection doesn't demand that you sacrifice yourself in order to be loved. It doesn't collapse the moment you set a boundary. It doesn't vanish when you say no. When people are drawn to your usefulness rather than your essence, they don't panic when you're in pain. They panic when you stop performing. So you keep performing. You keep responding to texts when you're exhausted. You keep showing up in conversations you don't want to have. You keep saying yes when your body is screaming no. And no one notices the difference because they never learned to look for your truth. They only learned to rely on your function. This is the emotional erosion of availability. The more present you are for others, the more you disappear from yourself. And the more predictable you become, the less respect you command. Because in human psychology, what is always there loses its value. Familiarity doesn't just breed contempt, it breeds expectation. You stop being someone to appreciate and start becoming someone to assume, someone to summon, someone to drain. And if you've ever felt like people only reach out when they need something, this is why. They're not relating to you. They're relating to the role you've played for them. And the moment you change the script, they respond with confusion, anger, distance. Not because you've done something wrong, but because you've stopped being useful. That's the consequence of being endlessly available. You become emotionally disposable. Not because you don't matter, but because they never had to earn you. So now you're left with a question most people are too afraid to ask. Who would still be here if I stopped performing? Who would reach out if I didn't respond first? Who values my presence, and not just the relief it gives them? These questions hurt, but they also clarify, because they lead you to the threshold where people fall away, and the truth begins. But to walk through that threshold, you need something more than distance. You need understanding. You need a new relationship with your energy. And that's where Jung's concept of psychic energy enters, not just as theory, but as survival. Carl Jung didn't see the psyche as a machine. He saw it as a living energy field. Your thoughts, emotions, behaviors, they're not just responses to the world. They are movements of energy. And energy, by nature, is finite. Every time you overextend yourself, overexplain your boundaries, or respond to a message you didn't want to receive, you're not just losing time, you're leaking energy. Yeah, you might not see it, but you feel it. That low-grade fatigue after a pointless conversation. The tension in your body after defending yourself against someone who never really listened. The emotional hangover after giving your all to someone who never reciprocates. We've been taught to think of burnout as something that happens in work. But emotional burnout is just as real, and far more insidious. It builds slowly. Every unnecessary yes, every text answered while your stomach turned, every time you let your peace be the price of someone else's comfort. This is not sensitivity, it's mismanagement. Jung believed that when we don't protect our energy, we become vulnerable to psychic fragmentation. Our sense of self becomes unstable, and we lose the clarity to choose. We react instead of respond. We defend instead of observe. We serve instead of act. And that's exactly what manipulative people count on. They don't need to control you directly. They just need to know which emotional strings to pull, and they watch you move. A passive-aggressive comment, a delayed reply, a guilt-loaded silence. That's all it takes to hook you back into the loop. But here's the secret. No one can manipulate a boundary you don't explain. No one can use a reaction you never offer. This is why the beginning of sovereignty starts with containment. Containment doesn't mean you become cold, it means you concentrate. Your energy, like fire behind glass, still burning, still alive, but not available to just anyone who walks by. It means recognizing that not every battle is yours to fight, not every opinion needs an answer, not every message needs a reply. Your energy is not a donation, it is not public property. Jung wrote that a healthy psyche is one that keeps its energy within the system. Not because it's selfish, but because it's at whole. When your energy stays with you, you begin to regenerate. You sleep better, you think more clearly, you speak with less effort, but more weight. And this creates a subtle shift in how the world responds to you. You walk into a room and people feel something. Not because you said anything, but because your presence isn't diluted anymore. You are no longer emotionally predictable. And in a world that profits from your distraction, that's power. But be warned. When you stop feeding the noise gets louder. People will say you've changed. They'll say you're cold, arrogant, distant. What they really mean is, I can't reach you like I used to. And that's the point. This is the moment where you must hold the line. Not with aggression, but with awareness. Not every trigger deserves your attention. Not every wound needs to be reopened. Not every person deserves access to the life force that moves through you. Because when your energy is no longer scattered, it becomes sacred. And from that sacred space, something new begins to form. Not just protection, but perception. You start to see the game, the projections, the stories people tell to keep you reactive, guilty, and small. And once you see it, you can't go back. Once you begin conserving your energy, something unexpected happens. You start to see people more clearly, not as they appear, but as they act. You start to notice how certain people only reach out when they're in crisis, how their checking in always arrives with an ask, how their affection is timed perfectly to when you're pulling away. At first, this realization hurts, because these aren't enemies. These are the people you've loved, supported, and shaped yourself around. But that pain is a sign of progress. It means the illusion is breaking. Carl Jung taught that people don't just relate to who you are, they relate to who they need you to be. They cast their unresolved fears, desires, and insecurities onto you like shadows on a wall. And you, out of love or habit or fear, agree to play the part. You become the fixer, the peacekeeper, the emotional sponge, not because you wanted to, but because they couldn't face what's inside them. That's what projection does. It makes you responsible for feelings that were never yours. They feel neglected, so they accuse you of being distant. They feel inferior, so they call you arrogant. They feel out of control, so they say you're cold. But these aren't descriptions of you. They are reflections of what they can't acknowledge in themselves. And as long as you're emotionally available, You become the canvas for these projections. You become their unfinished story, their mirror, their escape. This is the most subtle and effective form of manipulation. It doesn't need commands, it just needs your compliance. And that compliance is often powered by one thing: guilt. Guilt convinces you that setting a boundary is cruel, that silence is abandonment, that your needs are an inconvenience to others. So you keep giving, you keep responding, you keep playing the role, even when it's killing something inside you. But something changes the moment you pause. You don't respond, you don't explain, you don't rush to fix what someone else broke. And suddenly, the mask they placed on you begins to fall. Because without your reaction, their story collapses. They don't know who you are anymore. And worse, they're forced to look at who they've become. Most people aren't ready for that, so they lash out. They guilt trip. They withdraw. Not because you did something wrong, but because you're no longer a useful mirror. Jung said, "We do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." When you stop playing the role, their darkness rises, and your silence, your refusal to participate, becomes the trigger. But here's the gift. Their projection only works if you believe it. Once you realize that their discomfort is not your responsibility, you're free. Once you stop defending yourself, you stop being defined by them. Once you stop carrying what was never yours, you finally feel the weight lift. And in that empty space, you can begin to feel something rare: your own clarity, your own presence, your own power. In a world obsessed with noise, silence is rebellion. Not the silence of avoidance, the silence of awareness. The kind that doesn't beg, doesn't defend, doesn't explain. The kind that lets discomfort do its work. The kind that lets people reveal themselves in your absence. This kind of silence is not emptiness, it's concentration. When you stop reacting, you start observing. When you stop rushing to fill every gap, you begin to hear what lives inside the gaps. Silence slows the game down, and in that stillness, you see the cycles for what they are. You notice how someone always creates drama when you pull away. You notice the way they bait you into arguments just to keep you tethered. You notice how your presence was never valued, only used to manage their anxiety. But this time, you don't respond, and that changes everything. Because your reaction was the fuel. Your availability was the signal. I can still be accessed. I can still be pulled in. Without it, they're left in a space they don't know how to occupy, their own. And what they find there is often too loud to bear. That's why silence is so threatening. Not because of what it says, but because of what it doesn't allow others to avoid. Carl Jung spoke of silence not as a void, but as a fertile container, the ground in which true individuation can begin. In silence, you return to yourself, not as a concept, but as a reality. You begin to notice the tension in your shoulders when someone talks over you. You begin to hear the internal no before your mouth says yes. You begin to feel, maybe for the first time, that you are allowed to take up space, without apology. Silence reclaims your center. And from that center, your presence becomes undeniable. You don't need to raise your voice. You don't need to prove your worth. You don't need to explain why you walked away. Your absence explains itself. And it says more than words ever could. It says, I'm not here to be managed. I'm not available for manipulation. I'm not giving my energy to anyone who hasn't earned my trust. But make no mistake, silence has a cost. It will push away people who only knew how to relate to your availability. It will confuse people who relied on your emotional labor. It will trigger those who interpreted your always saying yes as love. You'll be called cold, detached, selfish. But what they're really saying is, you're not who I needed you to be. And they're right, you're not. You're no longer playing a role to soothe someone else's discomfort. You're no longer bleeding out energy just to keep the peace. Because peace that costs your center was never peace at all. It was a performance. And silence breaks the performance. It turns the lights on in the theater. It shows the script, It exposes the patterns, and it asks you, do you still want to play this role? Most people never leave the stage. They keep acting until the curtain falls. But some choose to walk off mid-scene, not with anger, not with drama, but with presence, with silence, with sovereignty. And when they do, something rare happens. They stop being part of the script and start becoming the author. At first, it's quiet, too quiet. When you stop reacting, stop performing, stop over-giving, what's left is a silence that doesn't just surround you, it presses in. It asks questions you've been avoiding. It creates space where there used to be noise. It strips away the mirrors that once told you who you were based on who needed you, and that silence can feel like loss. You'll wonder if you made a mistake, if you were too harsh, if you've pushed away people who once cared. But slowly, something begins to emerge. In that emptiness, you start to feel yourself again. Not the mask, not the role, but the one beneath it all. The one who doesn't need to be needed. The one who doesn't need to be liked to feel grounded. The one who doesn't need external approval to feel whole. This is not isolation, it's individuation. It's what Carl Jung described as the process of becoming who you truly are, not who the world wanted you to be, not who you became to survive, but the real self, the essential self, the one that has always been there, waiting in the quiet. This self doesn't beg, it doesn't explain, it doesn't chase, it chooses. It chooses peace over performance, clarity over chaos, depth over attention. And in doing so, it becomes something rare, something the world doesn't quite know how to categorize. You become unavailable, but not out of anger. You become selective, but not out of arrogance. You become free, but not detached. You are simply whole. And wholeness doesn't need validation. It doesn't fit into other people's projections. It no longer lives in the tension of, am I enough? Because it finally sees that it always was. This rebirth isn't loud. It doesn't require reinvention or grand declarations. It's more like remembering, more like returning. You begin to notice what resonates and what drains. You begin to feel the weight of your yes again and treat it like a sacred offering. You stop offering yourself to situations that don't honor your presence, and without realizing it, you begin to glow differently. But there's something else, something no one tells you. This transformation has a price. You'll lose people. You'll outgrow rooms. You'll be misunderstood by those who only knew the version of you that said yes to everything. You'll be called distant by those who only valued your closeness when it was convenient. You'll be judged for your boundaries by those who had none. You'll be whispered about by the ones who depended on your silence to stay in control. And it will hurt, not because they're gone, but because you now see what was never real. But with that clarity comes something more powerful than comfort: sovereignty. Emotional sovereignty is the knowing that your peace is not up for negotiation, that your energy is not a product to be consumed, that your presence is earned, not assumed. It's the quiet confidence that says, I don't need you to understand me to remain at peace. Because the ones who are meant for this new version of you, this grounded, sovereign, whole version, will not require your explanation. They will not flinch at your silence. They will not crumble when you say no. They'll meet you where you are, and they'll speak the same language. But until then, walk alone. Walk not in bitterness, but in clarity. Not in ego, but in essence. Not in defense, but in truth. Because when you are no longer available for everything, you become available for what's real. And what's real will recognize you.